Well, it's not quite December yet, so I thought we'd dip back into the Disney Vault and talk about the next one. The Fox and the Hound. Now, The Fox and the Hound is Disney's 24th feature-length animated film, and this movie usually marks the beginning of the dark age of Disney. The dark age is usually between this movie and right before The Little Mermaid, around Oliver and Company. But for me personally, I always consider the dark age to start a little earlier, maybe around The Rescuers, because that movie, I don't really have many nice things to say. The Fox and the Hound, though, is a marked improvement over The Rescuers in many different ways, particularly in the animation. The animation in Fox and the Hound is one of the best things about it. You can clearly tell that they have a new set of animators. Most of the 9 old men were either retired or are retiring shortly after the release of this movie, and you can tell that this was a big handoff project to the younger animators, one of which was a young Tim Burton, who unfortunately did not stick with the Walt Disney Company very long. He got kind of disillusioned and he couldn't match his aesthetic with the Disney aesthetic, but that's just one example. There's a whole team of animators on this movie that grew up with the Disney aesthetic, that know how to do that classic Disney cuddly creature look, and it shows in this movie. And the animation is pretty clean. It still uses the Xerox process, which does give you that scratchy, sketchy look that a lot of the movies around this time use, but for some reason this looks a lot cleaner. That's probably because these younger animators took more of an effort to clean up their pencil marks before it went into the Xerox process to be inked. And most of this movie feels like another attempt at something like Bambi. Now, it's not exactly Bambi and it does its own story, but aesthetically, the forest, the use of the multi-plane camera, is something that hasn't been used a lot in Disney movies around this time. It was a welcomed return. We feel like we're in the forest. It has that depth to it that I love from the multi-plane camera. And the animal designs have this classic Disney, cute, friendly, cuddly feel to it, but they still feel like animals. Towards the end of the movie, there's a lot more teeth and snarling than you're probably used to in a Disney movie, which for me is a welcomed change. I would like to see these animals act a little bit more animalistic and rely on the physicality of the animation over the lines from the voice cast, which, again, talking about Bambi is something that movie did a lot of. There's a lot of visual storytelling there. Our titular characters, the Fox and the Hound, once they've grown up, they don't have that many lines together, or lines period. They have probably about a handful each. I think Todd actually gets more lines because there's this whole romance subplot with Vixie, and we'll get to that. But I do appreciate that this movie had the restraint to just let some of these scenes lie without any dialogue, just let it sit in the atmosphere it created to really give you this more realistic world of animals interacting. Which, let's talk about the voice cast for a minute, because this is a very eclectic mix of voices that we've got here. It's something that I wasn't really expecting going in. Full disclosure, I haven't watched The Fox and the Hound for years. I watched it a few times when I was a kid. I always thought it was fine. It was a little sappy at times and a little sad at other times, so it wasn't one of my favorites, but it was something I had some fond memories with, and I just kind of let it lie. Didn't really feel like revisiting it for a long time, and watching it again, I had no idea the amount of memorable voices in this movie. You have, of course, Pat Buttram as Chief, and he's a Disney mainstay. He's been in a bunch of Disney movies around this time. You probably remember him most recently as the Sheriff of Nottingham. He was one of the rodents in The Rescuers. So, okay, that's a classic Disney voice, no big surprise. Same thing with the little porcupine that Todd runs into in this movie. He's voiced by the voice of Piglet from Winnie the Pooh, and another Winnie the Pooh voice actor that makes an appearance is the voice of Tigger, and he plays a woodpecker in this movie. So, okay, all these classic Disney voices coming back, feeling very cozy in this vintage Disney space, but then we get the voice cast for our Fox and Hound, and there's actually 2 sets of voices. There's the young voices of the Fox and the Hound, which I don't really remember who voiced the Fox, but he does a fine job. It fits. He sounds like a kid. But then you have Corey Feldman as the Hound, and it's a voice that I never associated with Corey Feldman. Corey Feldman, you know, Lost Boys, The Goonies, classic 80s child actor, beloved by many. I had no idea that he was the voice of young Copper in this movie, because his voice just sounds so natural and innocent and childlike, and it just fits the character so well that you don't even notice it was a celebrity voice. I'm not even sure if he was a celebrity, because this is the early 80s, and I'm not really sure at what point he became a household name, but that was cool to see in the credits. But the real celebrity voices come into play when we have the adult version of Todd and Copper. And Todd's voiced by Mickey Rooney, who you probably know as Santa Claus from the Rankin Bass Christmas specials. But aside from being a famous golden age of Hollywood child star that really hasn't stopped working his whole life, he's actually a pretty solid voice actor because he has a gruffness in his voice that grounds the characters in whatever world they're in. But he has this childlike whimsy and wonder about it too, which for Todd is perfect. It doesn't really distract. I was actually kind of concerned that I'd only be able to hear Santa Claus in that older ho 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 kind of voice, because he's actually quite a few years older now than he was when he played Santa Claus, but his voice still sounded young, so I appreciated that. Then you have Copper, who I was shocked to find out is voiced by Kurt Russell. That's right, Snake Plissken himself was Copper in The Fox and the Hound, which isn't that big a surprise when you really think about when this movie came out and where Kurt Russell was. But he started at Disney as a child actor, and he did a lot of teen comedies with Disney, and he had a great working relationship with them. So it makes sense that he would be cast in a Disney animated movie. And his voice in this movie does match what Copper should be. Copper's a hound dog. I think he's supposed to be a bloodhound, but I could be wrong about that. And Kurt Russell's, I'm just gonna call it John Wayne style voice acting, does fit that role pretty well. It's a grounded hunting dog kind of voice. My only complaint is that we don't really get that much out of Kurt Russell. Most of Copper's lines are when he's a young pup and him and Todd are goofing off together, or Copper's talking to Chief, and it's these, cutesy little moments. But once they're adults, there's not that much dialogue. It's actually very quiet and atmospheric and animalistic. There's a lot more growling and snarling from these adult characters than actual lines. So it is a little weird that they got these pretty big names to voice these characters that just don't have many lines at all. It must have been a pretty easy paycheck for these guys. But like I said before, I do appreciate that because it lets the drama of the story really sink in. And I think the second half is way stronger a movie than the first half. Because this movie is ultimately about a friendship being ripped apart. And when the movie focuses on that aspect, it's really good classic Disney storytelling at its best. It's surprisingly heartfelt. It doesn't really pull its punches. You see the love that these two animals share for each other when they're young, and then when Copper goes off on his hunting trip, he comes back a fully grown hunting dog. And while they try to save their friendship now that things have changed, Chief doesn't see it that way. And Amos, oh my gosh, I forgot to talk about Amos. Amos is another incredible voice talent because he's voiced by Charlie's grandfather from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, which is a great choice. He's got that crotchety old man energy that is just perfect for this kind of character. And now that Todd is grown up and he's not this cute, cuddly little foxling anymore, he's seen as a genuine threat to Amos's farm, and he sends out Chief and Copper to go find and kill this fox. And Copper, not wanting to actually kill his best friend, does decide to let him go, but Chief is not going to let him go. And it really comes to a head when they're on the railroad tracks and Chief gets injured. And it's this part of the movie where it's very evident that Disney had to rein it in, because clearly when you watch this movie and you watch the other characters' reaction to the scene, Chief should have died in that accident. He got hit by a train, he fell off a cliff, he smashed on some rocks, he's unconscious, and Copper sniffs him a little bit and then gives a look of just grief and anger. And from that point to the end of the movie, he is on a mission to eliminate Todd. All the friendship and good memories that they've shared is gone at that point because he just killed his mentor. But Disney probably couldn't let that happen, so what they did is they rewrote it, they cleaned it up a little bit where he's not dead, he just has a busted leg, so he's kind of out of commission for the rest of the movie. And then all the characters talk about, oh, how Todd almost killed the Chief. And for me, that just doesn't hit as strong as if Chief had actually died, and now Copper needs to take on that role of being the lead hunting dog. With Chief still being there even though he's injured, that transition is not complete. So as morbid as it sounds, I do wish that Chief did die in this movie. And even looking at it from a kids movie perspective, it wouldn't be any more traumatic than Bambi's mother dying or Mufasa dying in The Lion King. But like I said, from that point on, Copper and Amos are on the hunt for Todd. They're trying every trick in the book to try to catch this fox. Meanwhile, Todd is falling in love with a female fox, and this does bring up another issue that I do have with this movie. As great as some of the visual storytelling is, as great as this relationship between Todd and Copper is developed, those are the highlights. This movie has a real problem with filler. because there's a lot of it in this movie. And I usually don't mind filler in a Disney movie because it's usually pretty well paced. Usually the comedic relief will take up the mantle of this filler to try to draw out the runtime and add some legitimately funny jokes and some good character moments. But here, the filler doesn't feel like that. It just feels like filler. Because you have Big Mama, who's kind of like a female version of the owl from Bambi, who's just this moral compass trying to guide Todd along, trying to help him live his best life. And then you have these two birds, the woodpecker I already talked about, and then Dinky, this little sparrow. And they're spending the entire movie trying to chase this caterpillar. And it's not nearly as interesting or funny as the movie thinks it is, because we spend a lot of time with these characters, and aside from the voice of Tigger coming out of this woodpecker, which does have some legitimately funny moments, it's not nearly as funny or interesting as Lucifer and the Mice from Cinderella or Hook and the Crocodile from Peter Pan. Those also had kind of their filler moments, but those were really interesting characters and really funny slapstick comedy, but this one, not so much. And the other aspect is Todd's romantic relationship with Vixie, and I understand why they did it. They have to show that Todd is thriving in the woods, finding some happiness, because he recently lost every friend he ever had. The widow that cared for him when he was a kid tossed him out in probably one of the biggest tearjerker moments in the whole movie. And then the whole thing with Copper and Chief just ending that relationship, period. So I understand why he needed to find some solace in somebody. I just don't think this relationship is really fleshed out. I don't think it's all that interesting. And again, it just kind of feels like filler. Every time we're having a scene with Vixie and the birds, I wish we'd just cut back to what's actually important in this story. Amos, Copper, and Todd, and that rivalry that's forming, that's splitting that relationship apart, and the really hurt feelings on both sides. And to this movie's credit, when it does focus on that, it hits. But unfortunately, there's a lot of this movie that you just kind of have to sit through or fast forward through to get to those really important character moments. So yeah, The Fox and the Hound is a bit of a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, you have a really interesting story of a fox and a hound, friends in their youth that just get ripped apart by society. And it's really powerful when it focuses on that. And you have an actually improving Disney animation studio that looks like the animation quality is actually getting better instead of declining, which was the trend of the previous few that I've reviewed. And the voice cast is top notch. They've got some fantastic voice talent in this movie that I feel like gets underappreciated when people talk about this movie. I feel like if you were to ask anybody, okay, who are some of the voice actors from this movie? Who voiced Copper, for instance? I feel like nobody would be able to tell you. But Kurt Russell, Mickey Rooney, Corey Feldman, and everybody else do a great job bringing to life these very likable characters. But on the other hand, when you actually watch the movie, the core of the story does get lost from time to time, whether it be from filler or whether it's the pulling back of some of the darker moments. I feel like this movie would be a lot better remembered if it did focus up on the real point to the story, which is the fox and the hound and their friendship turned rivalry. Now I turn over to you guys. What do you think about The Fox and the Hound? Is it a Disney movie that you've watched a lot, or is it one of those that you just kind of forget about? Whatever you think, let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.